1 October 1949, Beijing, China. The 55-year-old Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong declares the creation of the People's Republic of China, or PRC. This announcement sends shockwaves out across the world and ends a bloody decades-long civil war between Mao's Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, and Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party, or Kuomintang, or KMT. The creation of a communist state and Mao's subsequent policies would have dire consequences for China and its people. How's it, young Stashers? I'm Dr. Lekker. This is Stashy, and you're watching The Historian Stash. So last week we looked at a very broad overview of the Cold War. We saw what the differences were between a hot war and a Cold War. We also discussed the origins of the Cold War and how it became an entire era that would last for almost half a century. Lastly, we checked out some of the significant events that took place during that era. For the next couple of weeks, we'll check out two case studies of the Cold War, namely Communist China and the Vietnam War. This week, we are traveling to Mao's China.
I know China very well. China.
Now, today, China is emerging as a global superpower, rivaling the USA as an economic powerhouse. But 75 years ago, China was caught up in a hectic civil war and ruled by a despotic dictator whose disastrous policies would end in the deaths of millions of people. That dictator was Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong, or Mao Zedong as Westerners call him, was born in 1893, and as a lighty, he witnessed the fall of the Qing dynasty and the chaotic era that followed. Inspired by Marxist ideology, Mao joined the Communist Party and embarked on a journey to transform China. He got involved in the Chinese Civil War waged between the Communists and the Nationalist Forces, or the KMT. During this war, Mao and his comrades found themselves being chased by the KMT forces in what became known as the Long March of 1934 to 1935. This would become a pivotal moment for Mao. During this Chinese version of the Great Trek, Mao solidified his status as a dominant leader within the Communist Party. So the Long March gave Mao some serious street cred. He became a symbol of resilience and endurance, laying the foundation for his rise to power. In December 1937, the Communists and Nationalists temporarily united against a common enemy, Japan. By this time, the Japanese invaders had taken both Shanghai and Nanjing, resulting in the Nanjing Massacre. The Japanese brutality led to increasing numbers of Chinese recruits joining the fight, and the Communist Red Army particularly grew significantly. But as the war was ending in 1945 and it was clear the Japanese were defeated, tensions flared up again, and the Civil War carried on where it left off. The Civil War would rage on for another 4 years. Then in 1949, the Communists emerged victorious from the fight, leading to the establishment of the People's Republic of China on the 1st of October 1949. The Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, officially took control of mainland China, and the People's Republic of China, or PRC, was created. This forced the KMT, led by Chiang Kai-shek, to retreat to the island of Taiwan, and so began a new era. Initially, Mao was seen as a charismatic and strong leader, a man of the people. He was one of the Brasa. His views as a Marxist were strongly influenced by Lenin. Mao believed that only the correct leadership of the CCP could advance China into proper socialism. But at the same time, Mao also believed that mass movements and mass criticism were necessary in order to check the bureaucracy that they were doing their job. So he believed that government should be held accountable by the people, even if he was the head of government, or so it seemed. Shortly after Mao took power, the Korean War broke out. As we saw last week, the war broke out when the Communist North Korea invaded South Korea. As part of its Cold War strategy of containment in the Far East, the United States and its allies intervened and pushed back North Korea's People's Army all the way almost to the Chinese border. Mao then decided to help out his North Korean comrades and sent the People's Volunteer Army, a special unit of the Chinese Army, or the People's Liberation Army, into the war. The Chinese bolstered the ranks of the North Koreans with sheer numbers and drove the US forces back. The war then ended in an uneasy ceasefire between the North and the South, which is actually still in effect to this day. So no side actually won, but China's involvement angered the US, and so China became a major player in the Cold War. As a result of the war, the US placed a trade embargo on China. This embargo lasted for about 20 years, until US President Richard Nixon tried to improve relations with China in the early 1970s. It's said that at least 180,000 Chinese troops died during the Korean War. During the land reform campaigns, large numbers of landlords and rich peasants were beaten to death at mass meetings organized by the CCP, as land was taken from them and given to poorer peasants. The campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries targeted bureaucratic bourgeoisie, such as merchants and former government officials who were seen by the party as economic parasites or political enemies. Mao himself claimed that a total of 700,000 people were killed in these attacks between 1950 and 1952 alone. The total number of deaths are estimated to be between 2 million and 5 million. In addition, at least 1.5 million people, perhaps as many as 4 to 6 million people, were sent to so-called reform through labor camps, where many died. Mao played a personal role in organizing the mass repressions and established a system of execution quotas, which were often exceeded. He defended these killings as necessary for the securing of power. As he said himself, communism is not love. Communism is a hammer which we use to crush the enemy.
Yeah, well, you know, that's just like your opinion, man.
Mao eradicated both the consumption and production of opium during the 1950s. 10 million addicts were forced into compulsory treatment, drug dealers were executed, and opium-producing regions were replanted with new crops. As a result of this crackdown, opium production shifted south of the Chinese border into the Golden Triangle region in Myanmar, Thailand, and Laos.
Following his consolidation of power, Mao was inspired by Soviet Union leader Joseph Stalin and introduced the first five-year plan of 1953 to 1958. Now, if you're inspired by a genocidal and paranoid bully like Stalin, then maybe that should come across as a massive red flag. Oh, wait. In any event, Mao's first 5-year plan was all about rapid industrial development. Within industry, iron and steel, electric power, coal, heavy engineering, building materials and basic chemicals were prioritized with the aim of constructing large and productive industrial plants. Many of these plants were built with Soviet Union assistance, and heavy industry grew rapidly. Agriculture, industry, and trade were organized on a collective basis or socialist cooperatives. This period marked the beginning of China's rapid industrialization, and it resulted in an enormous success. But then, the Great Leap Forward happened. In January 1958, Mao launched his second 5-year plan, known as the Great Leap Forward, a plan to turn China from an agricultural nation to an industrialized one, and as an alternative model for economic growth to the Soviet model, focusing on heavy industry. Under his economic program, the relatively small agricultural collectives that had been formed since Mao's rise to power were absorbed into far larger people's communes, and many of the peasants were ordered to work on massive infrastructure projects and on the production of iron and steel. Private food production was banned, and livestock and farm implements were brought under collective ownership. Under the Great Leap Forward, Mao and other party leaders ordered the implementation of a variety of unproven and unscientific new agricultural techniques by the new communes. The combined effect of sending peasants to steel production and infrastructure projects, and natural disasters such as typhoons and droughts, led to an approximately 15% drop in grain production in 1959, followed by a further 10% decline in 1960, and no recovery in 1961. In a society where failure meant imprisonment or death, state officials resorted to doing some crazy things in order to cover up their failures. For example, in an effort to win favor with their superiors and avoid being purged, lower-level party officials exaggerated the amount of grain produced under them. Based upon the falsely reported success, party members were ordered to demand a disproportionately large amount of the harvest for state use, not only for cities, but also for export. The problem was that these harvest yields did not exist. The result was that farmers were left with little food for themselves because everything was being taken to the cities and overseas. So millions of people starved to death in what became known as the Great Chinese Famine. The people of urban areas in China were given food stamps each month, but the people of rural areas were expected to grow their own crops and give some of the crops back to the government. Also, the Chinese government continued to export food that could have been allocated to the country's starving citizens. The famine was a direct cause of death of around 30 million Chinese peasants between 1959 and 1962. The total death figure may even be as high as 45 million people altogether. Many children who became malnourished during the years of hardship also died only after the Great Leap Forward came to an end in 1962. Whether it's 30 million or 45 million, this is more deaths than any single famine in recorded history. Following the Great Leap Forward and the Great Chinese Famine, which weren't actually so great, Mao was sidelined by the more moderate faction within the CCP. But then in May 1966, as part of his attempt to win back some popularity, Mao claimed that bourgeois elements had infiltrated the government and society with the aim of restoring capitalism. And so another social engineering project called the Cultural Revolution, or the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, was launched by Mao and his supporters. The Cultural Revolution was a radical social and political movement aimed at purging perceived bourgeois groups and consolidating Mao's power. Mao called on young people to bombard the CCP headquarters and proclaimed that to rebel is justified. Many young people, mainly students, responded by forming cadres of Red Guards throughout the country. Another part of Mao's publicity campaign was the publication of a selection of his sayings that were compiled into the Little Red Book, which became revered within his little cult of personality. In 1967, emboldened radicals began seizing power from local governments and party branches, establishing new revolutionary committees in their place. These committees often split into rival factions, leading to armed clashes among the radicals. The Cultural Revolution was characterized by hectic violence and chaos across China. Estimates of the death toll vary widely, ranging from 500,000 to 2 million. Initially, relations between the PRC and the Soviet Union were quite friendly. Mao and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin were pretty tight chummies even before Mao took power. Mao liked how Stalin was doing things and wished to emulate him. In 1950, the two comrades signed a treaty of friendship, alliance, and mutual assistance. This improved the two countries' relationship on political, military, and economic levels. The treaty formalized the inclusion of China into the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. In the context of the Cold War, this was a big deal because of China's strategic geographic position as well as its massive population. But unlike the Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe, the USSR did not control Mao's government. In March 1953, Stalin died and Nikita Khrushchev became the new Soviet leader. But Mao and Khrushchev did not like each other. Khrushchev began a series of reforms called de-Stalinization in the USSR. This meant reversing many of the policies introduced by Stalin. For example, Stalin took a confrontational approach toward the West, whereas Khrushchev wished for peaceful coexistence. This did not sit well with Mao. He had emulated Stalin's style of leadership and practical application of Marxism-Leninism. So he saw Khrushchev's 180-degree turn as a diss to Stalin, his longtime comrade homeboy. In 1960, Mao expected Khrushchev to reprimand US President Dwight D. Eisenhower after an American U-2 spy plane was shot down by the USSR, exposing the CIA taking spy photographs of military bases in the Soviet Union. At a summit in Paris, Khrushchev demanded that Eisenhower apologize for spying in his backyard, but Eisenhower refused. Mao interpreted Eisenhower's refusal as a sign of disrespect of the national sovereignty of socialist countries and demanded that Khrushchev initiate a military confrontation with who he called the US aggressors. Obviously, Khrushchev couldn't start a war with another nuclear power, but this meant that Khrushchev had lost face with the PRC. In late 1962, the world avoided nuclear war following the Cuban Missile Crisis. But instead of a giant sigh of relief of not being blown to smithereens, China broke relations with the Soviet Union because Khrushchev did not go to war with the US. By this time, Mao had already denounced Soviet communism and declared the USSR to be social imperialists. For a communist to be called an imperialist is an enormous insult. This split between the Soviet Union and China, known as the Sino-Soviet split, was a big moment in Cold War politics. For Eastern Bloc countries, the split raised the question of who would lead the revolution of world communism and who would provide political advice, financial aid, and military assistance to socialist groups around the world. Both the USSR and the PRC would compete for the leadership of world communism by establishing their own separate spheres of influence. In the West, the split transformed the bipolar Cold War into a tripolar Cold War. It showed the West that communist countries were not always united in their ideology. It also presented an opportunity for the US to exploit the rivalry, leading to a cooling of relations between the US and the PCR in the 1970s. However, there was still some cooperation between the USSR and China. Both countries continued their support of North Vietnam during the Vietnam War, despite their rivalry elsewhere. That's it for now. Next week, we'll continue China as a case study by checking out its ever-changing relationship with the USA, as well as its neighbors. Until next time, from Stashy and myself, stay stashy.